Welcome, everyone. So glad you've joined me today because we're in for a treat. I have a beautiful guest with me today who is going to talk us through what I think for some people can be a bit of a difficult subject. We're going to be talking about suicide. And I'm just going to say right out the front, if there's anything about that subject that is triggering for you or makes you feel uncomfortable, you don't have to listen to this podcast. But if you do and you find yourself feeling a bit sort of stirred up by it, please seek support from anyone that you have in your life that would be supportive, or if it's an emergency, obviously call 911. But my guest is Lisa Sugarman, and Lisa and I don't know each other. In fact, we just met, which is kind of fun for me because she is someone who is, I'm going to say her resume here. She's an author, a syndicated columnist, a 3-time survivor of suicide loss, a storyteller with NAMI, and a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project. And she's got quite a story, and she's also got quite a uplifting sort of point to make about everything. And so I'm really thrilled to welcome you, Lisa, to the podcast.
Oh, thanks, Bonnie. I'm happy to be here. Excited to get into it.
Yeah, me too. So suicide, that's something, I know you work as a crisis counselor, so it's probably not a unfamiliar term for you to even use with your work. And I was a crisis counselor for a while, and now as a psychologist, it's definitely a term that we talk about, that we use, and that we're very transparent and open about. But I don't think the regular population is so much. I certainly know people who don't even want to say the word.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact of the matter is it exists, and that people go through it with family members or people they know. And then there's a sort of everlasting, I think, ripple effect of that. So you have quite the story. Could you tell us just kind of in an introductory way, why is it that you're speaking about writing about suicide?
Well, my story is a little bit different. I mean, you said it in my intro that I am a survivor. I'm a 3-time survivor. I lost my father, I lost a cousin, and I lost a very, very dear childhood friend only a few years ago. So I've been accompanied by this kind of grief my whole life. It's been since I was 9 years old. My cousin took his life the following year. I lost my father, and it continued on until I was an adult. And it was really when I learned that my father had taken his life, which didn't happen when he died when I was 10 years old. So I lost him in 1978. I didn't learn that my father had taken his own life until I was 45 years old, which is exactly how old he was when he passed away. And it was really in learning that truth, which I would never, ever have suspected. No one had any signs or signals that my dad had any kind of mental illness or was struggling. My mom and dad had this beautiful, beautiful relationship. They'd been married for 18 years. They were the love of each other's lives. My mother had no idea, and he was just very good at hiding it. And it was when I learned that truth that, I mean, the obvious outcome was that it just tore me in half. It tore me in a million pieces, and I'm still putting all those pieces back together. But it ignited something in me that number one, needed to learn more about that state of mind, that place that someone's in when they're that desperate. And then I needed to somehow not only make sense of it, if you can, which I'm not sure that you can make sense of it, but I needed to find a way to make my father's loss somehow worth something. I needed to pay it forward, whatever I was learning about suicide. And I started slowly just sharing my story and talking about it. And I'm a writer by trade. It's what I do. And so I started writing about it. I started creating video messages about it. I'm working on another book about it. I started storytelling. And then I you kind of keep saying to yourself, well, what can I do now? What can I do that's going to have a bigger impact? And it led me to becoming a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project. So I'm on the crisis lifelines with people who are suicidal and who are potentially dealing with a million different types of crises in their lives that don't just relate to suicide, but that are all mental health challenges. So I'm there to listen to those folks and keep kind of using what I've learned along the way to benefit other people. And so that's kind of the long story of how I wound up here doing what I'm doing.
Yeah. And just quickly before we get into kind of how you found out, I just want to say, just as a therapist, psychologist who works with people who are struggling with a plethora of challenges from trauma or just life. Not everybody takes what happens to them and uses it as something to pay forward to move into a sort of use it as a purpose, meaningful.
Hmm.
And I love how you um, voiced that and that you wanted to kind of make meaning out of it. Where do you suppose that came from for you because you could have not, you know, lots of people don't, and no shame. That's just not where they are. It's not how they
Mm.
feel. What made you turn it into something like that, to put it out and pay it forward and to use it to this meaningful way?
I think it really was rooted in this understanding that I found within my own experience of the value of sharing your story and the value of connecting with a community who understands what you're going through. I was experiencing that as the suicide loss survivor, as the person who was grieving and the person who had lost so many people in my life. And those three suicides in my life are only three of a larger number, unfortunately, of people who I've lost in my life, relatives, grandparents, friends, unfortunately. So I've had this history of grief my whole life, and to have had all that experience and to have kind of acquired all this knowledge that you kind of don't want to have it. You really, this is an area that I do not want to be an expert in, but
Yeah,
I have a lot of lived experience in this place. And I felt like, because I saw how much it impacted me to be able to talk about it and share about it and hear from others who were maybe further ahead than I was, it just kind of unlocked something for me that said, well, if I'm benefiting so much from what I'm hearing and getting from other people in the world who are sharing with me, well, imagine what I might have the potential to do, who I might be able to reach
yeah,
with my story, my experience. Because look, suicide is such an incredibly nuanced thing. So I don't want to say that it's more traumatic than any other kind of loss. It's a different kind of trauma. And anybody who has experienced it knows that it's a very, very unique and challenging kind of loss to experience and to navigate. And, I had a lot of experience, and I felt like I knew what helped me personally and what didn't. And look, what helps me and helps me move through this may not help someone else. But one little piece of it, if it does resonate with someone, then that's the end game for me. So that's why I keep talking and I keep sharing. And I think that was just the catalyst for me.
yeah. And I think I have had clients in the past who um, have worked with AA, and I think they have some saying about secrets. I can't remember what it is right now. Maybe do you know what it is?
I don't. I think I know what you're talking about, but I'm not sure exactly what it is.
It's something just around, that secrets are where, the problem is, where the
Mm.
trouble lies is if you are holding a secret. And I think I wish I remember everybody's probably screaming at the radio right now. But it's around the idea of, the opposite of what you're doing. It's, you're shining a light. You're being transparent and vulnerable and open, which is hard. And
Hmm.
I respect you so much for that. I think
Thank
you
you.
are most likely changing lives that you have no idea that you're even reaching. So
I
I
hope so.
really applaud you for speaking about this. And a big reason I have this podcast is I want to demystify what therapy is, and I want to demystify what our mental health is, because
Mhm.
it's still got this stigma. Things are better sometimes, and other times you aren't so pleased with what's happening out there. So I just love the fact that this just opening the door to it. I'm a survivor, and I know what's helped me, and I want to talk about it, because just talking about it, or just getting the validation of hearing that someone else has gone through it, can help somebody realize that they're not alone. And that's
Mhm.
certainly the message here.
Yeah. Well,
Unfortunately,
that's it. That's really it, because when you kind of break it all down and you deconstruct it all, and you look at what all of this sharing creates, it creates community. It creates an environment where people don't feel judged, they don't feel shamed, they feel supported, they feel validated, and that's all anybody needs. Like, most of the time, and this is something I spend an awful lot of time doing on the crisis lifelines, just about holding space for somebody who needs
yeah,
to share what's going on the inside. It's not about having the answers. It's not about you saying to me, "Oh, I can fix this for you." There's no fix to grief in this case. I mean, there might be a fix to a medical issue, or um, some kind of a life challenge, but not a fix for this. And what most people who've gone through this just need is someone to listen to what they're feeling. And that in and of itself can sometimes elevate somebody to a place of, okay, I've been heard. This isn't in my head. I'm not the only one. And that's empowering.
yeah,
And there's a lot to be said for that.
yeah, yeah, um, yeah. So to switch gears a little bit on your story, you mentioned that you didn't know that your father's death was a suicide until you were 45,
Mm,
which was the age when he died.
right.
How did you hear about it?
So it wasn't some big dramatic revelation. It was really kind of kooky and bizarre how it happened. I was having lunch with my husband in our hometown, and a cousin of mine just happened to walk by. We were eating at a cafe outside, and my cousin came by, and we hadn't seen each other for a while. And we were just catching up. And she was asking about us and asking about our kids, who were teenagers at the time. So I found out about 10 years ago that my dad had taken his life. So she's asking all about my kids. And without even skipping a beat, she asked if my kids, either one of them, had some similar mental health challenges to my father. And I didn't know what she was saying. So she kind of broke it down and said, well, are your kids depressed the way your dad was? And do your kids have any of the mental illness that your dad had? I had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. I had
Wow.
never been witness to anything from my father. And granted, I was 10 years old, but I knew my dad, spent a ton of time with him, and for sure was unaware of him having any kind of mental health challenges at all. My mother was unaware. I mean, he was just a beautiful, vibrant, loving, supportive, present dad. And so that just kind of ignited its own little fuse in me. Not something that I went running back to my mom saying, "Did dad take his life?" Like, that was never even in my thinking, even after that kind of bizarre little conversation. But I did go back and I did talk to my mom after that, and said, "Was dad depressed?" And she, for the first time, acknowledged it, because I had never asked the question.
Yeah.
I was told he had had a heart attack in his sleep. I had never questioned it. He was a heavy smoker. As active as he was a heavy smoker. Never thought to challenge that. So I asked her for the first time. She said, yes, he was depressed. And then, before I even knew the words were coming out of my mouth, I never thought about it consciously, wasn't intending to ask the question. It just came out of my mouth. And I asked if he had taken his life. And she said yes. And that just kind of brought us right back to a very different first minute of the first day of all that grief again. And
Yeah.
now it was a completely different kind of grief. And here I had just turned 45, at the exact age that my father was, with kids as old as I was when I lost him. So it just spun me. it spun me off my feet for sure.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Mm,
Excuse me. The it's the narrative you had in your head, the story of him,
yeah.
and in a second, and it's interesting how you didn't plan on asking the question, which makes me think, our what hangs out there and in our out of our awareness is pretty crazy sometimes. The fact that
Yeah.
it was lurking there, but you hadn't even given yourself permission to make that a conscious thought, but it
No,
came
not
out
at all.
involuntarily anyway. Yeah,
Yeah.
like you
I have to
kinda knew.
say, yeah, I did, but I didn't. Like, it was just not even part of my conscious thinking. And so it really, I don't know if at that moment I was more startled by the answer or by the question.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean? Like, I really
yeah,
was so unprepared for that to come out of my mouth. And I certainly was never expecting that kind of an answer. But like you said, it just goes to show like the depths of our subconscious and what's really there. But I was completely unprepared for that moment. And so was my mom, because she had always promised herself that she would never share that with me, because she knew as a 10-year-old kid the level of pain that I was in losing my dad. My dad was my best friend. We did everything together. He was my buddy. I was a tomboy. He did all the things I loved to do. And to lose him was just so upending in every possible way that in that moment when she found out that he had taken his life, she just couldn't bear the thought of laying that on top of it all. And then, of course, you kind of, you go through your life and your child becomes, a teenager, and okay, that's not the right time to say anything. And then I'm going to high school. Nope, can't do it now. And then college. And it just kind of is this never ending cycle of, well, it's never going to be the right time. So
yeah.
I'm just going to let it lie, because it's inconsequential. She didn't feel like there was any reason why I needed to know that. And I mean, and I understood it. I mean, when she did tell me the truth, there was never even a second where I had any feelings of anger or feelings of betrayal or feelings of mistrust, like nothing. I got it instantly. Like, I was a mom. So she told me when I was a mom, I had 2 kids, and I was like, nope, I got it. I would never have wanted to put that on my kids either, and I would have done the same exact thing. Like, I'm grateful to
Mm,
her. To this
mm,
day, I'm so grateful to her for protecting me from that, because I definitely could not have handled it at
yeah.
that time. No way.
Did your did your mother go through, I don't know if you talked about this with her, but did she go because obviously she knew,
Mhm.
did she go through confusion, anger? What did she go through? Do you know?
Meaning at that time when I lost him?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we've talked. I would be shocked if there isn't. I mean, if there is something that my mother and I have not touched on in the last 10 years of kind of redissecting all of this, that is definitely something we've talked about a lot. And one of the things that my mom says very consistently, and has said it since the day the truth came out, was that I never felt a second of animosity toward your dad for taking his life. She said, I mean, she knew the basics of why he might have been stressed or depressed or feeling overwhelmed, because my dad ended up having basically 2 full-time jobs. He worked for an import-export company in Boston, which is where I'm from. And along with that, my grandparents had a pretty vibrant real estate business. They owned property, and my father took over when my grandfather passed away. So he was managing all these buildings, and that was a full-time job. And then he's got his other full-time job. So it was a lot he was carrying on his plate. And even more than that, his family was just very, very difficult. My dad's side of the family was just very bottom line oriented around money. And I have no hesitation to say that, because it's the truth. They were um, very cold family. They were not encouraging, not supportive, not loving. I mean, if it gives you any indication of what my dad grew up with, he was the youngest of 3 children. His nickname was the Unwanted.
Mm.
So take that apart as a therapist and
Yeah.
imagine how that
Mm.
sat with my dad his whole life. So, like, nothing he could ever do, no matter how well he did it. And he did everything so well, but nothing was ever good enough for his family. So we know that played a big role. But so she got it enough to know, okay, like, I know what some of the stress probably was, and she never held anything against him.
Mhm.
We've definitely cried our tears and been angry and sad and, um, you know, have missed him forever. But
Of course.
I know she just has never held anything against him at all.
So, it's, you work, as a crisis counselor. I have worked, as a crisis clinician and worked with crisis clinicians for a lot of years. I have huge respect. It's, unsung heroes for sure, people doing that work. It's a beautiful work. I feel like you meet people in their most raw realness, and it's,
Mm.
weirdly, I can say, an honor sometimes to meet someone like that and for them to show that to you.
Mhm.
It was the hardest and the most beautiful work I think I ever did. So I really respect that you do this work. So you come in contact with people, I am sure, who either are suicidal or know someone is suicidal. So first of all, a two-part question. Do you ever find yourself triggered? Do you find that difficult at times for yourself? And also, the second part to that question is, how do you tell people uh, if they are thinking about maybe trying to approach someone they know who is voicing uh, suicidal ideation, or just speaking about it in a way that's concerning? So on
Mhm.
the first side, yeah, what is your experience of it, and how does it make you feel in working with it? And second, what is your kind of advice for people who are maybe encountering it with people that they know?
Well, being a crisis counselor is by far one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had. It's such a bittersweet experience. That bitterness is that you never want to know that someone is feeling as low as they may be feeling when you pick up those phone calls. But that
Yeah.
the sweet part of it is, or the beautiful part of it, is knowing that at least you're there for them to share how they're feeling. You're there to receive it. You're not there to fix it. I mean, as much as every one of us wishes we could say the magic words that would completely relieve that person of any of their pain, whatever level of pain they have, like, that's not our job. Our job is to de-escalate. Our job is to support. Our job is to hold space, to listen. And I have never once, I've been doing this for over a year and a half now, and I have never once had an experience where I felt triggered or felt overwhelmed. It's so interesting too, because I'm an empath and I'm such a highly sensitive personality type that I feel everything. I feel all of the things around me all the time, the good, the bad, all that. And in doing that, it leaves me pretty vulnerable and gives me the capacity to be pretty affected by things. But something happens, Bonnie, like when I put on the headset and I take the call and I'm listening to someone who's just at their lowest point sometimes, I'm just right there. I'm just right there with them, and whatever I've experienced doesn't affect me in a negative way. It actually gives me the kind of empowerment and the kind of, I guess, um, capacity to deal with it with them and help them. So that's the first part of that, is that it's never been a difficult thing for me. And I'm fortunate because I know it can be triggering
Mm.
for us who are on the other end of that phone. And I do everything in my power to ensure that I have the coping skills that I need and the outlets that I need on my end to satisfy that, to take care of myself. So that's the first part. And the advice that I would give to anybody who's dealing with someone who is potentially suicidal, I would say directly to that person, talk to that person in very clear cut, very blunt language, and I would say be open and honest and say, "Are you feeling suicidal?" And use those words, because and if you're not using those direct words, you're not necessarily validating how in pain that person is. When you use words like, "Are you thinking of harming yourself? Are you thinking of harming someone else? Are you thinking of taking your life?" It shows that person who you're talking to that you see them and you hear them and you understand at least somewhat the level of pain that they're in. So that's what we're taught. We're taught to ask very, very specific questions when we perform a risk assessment on someone. We're asking, are you thinking of harming yourself? If yes, do you have a plan? Have you done anything today to act on that urge or impulse? And depending on how the person answers, then we kind of go through the yes path or we go through the no path. And, we kind of find out where we stand that way. But that's what I would always say. Just talk to somebody very bluntly and honestly, even though using those words is scary as hell. It's very, very, can be terrifying to ask someone, are you thinking of harming yourself? Because the last thing in the world you want to do is to implant the idea or help amplify the idea, but that's not what it does. And you know this, and I know this, but someone listening to us may not know that it's actually proven that when we address someone's suicidal ideation or behavior head on, it actually reduces the risk of them taking their life. So
Mhm.
that's what I would say.
Beautifully said. Thank you. I think
Yeah, of course.
you just really hit that just right. And it was making me think about when I first started being a crisis counselor. It was after I became a psychologist, but not a lot of people who are contemplating suicide uh, seriously, voluntarily walk into a therapist's office. It's not
Oh,
usually the
right.
way it works.
Mm-mm.
And so I didn't encounter it very much at all until I became a crisis counselor. And then, of course, it's all over the place. And I remember feeling that real uncomfortableness. You just brought it all right back to me. I remember the first few days and having a supervisor, mentor, just saying, you have to be clear. You have to ask the questions very clearly.
Mm.
Your uncomfortableness with the word or the questions is just validating for them that what they're feeling is something that shouldn't be spoken about, that is shameful, that is
Mhm.
something to be hidden. So
Mhm.
you've got to, she was quite firm with me. You've got to get over this and you've
Yeah.
got to be clear. And,
Mhm.
I did it for, I did it for about 6 years. And so she got much, much more comfortable,
Mm.
even saying the word. Cause I was around people that, whisper the word or, just all sorts of
Mm.
responses because it's very hard for people to think about if they haven't had the experience, right? If they haven't um, really even had these kind of conversations ever. So you've got your direct experience of being a survivor. And now
Mm.
you've got this experience of being a crisis counselor where you're talking about it with people
Mhm.
and you're being clear and you're asking them. And we have the whole sort of risk assessment of if they answer yes and how we go about it. But
Yeah.
this is the thing I guess we really want to hammer home to people. If you know someone, or if it is you, speaking about it with someone you trust, and it has to be somebody you feel, and there's crisis lines
Mhm.
all over the place. I know Massachusetts, where I used to live, is very good about their crisis lines for sure.
Mhm. Yeah.
But this is just you're exactly right. It's that counterintuitive idea that somehow if I say the word suicide, I'm going to plant the idea and you're going to say, oh, well, I'm going to go do that. I never even thought
Mhm.
of that. But thank you, Bonnie. Now I'm going to go
Yeah.
do it.
Right, right.
Just isn't how it works. And
No,
first of
not at
all,
all.
it's not a decision taken lightly by anyone. It is agonized over and it is difficult and it is horrible in the way in which people suffer, and a lot of times silently because they don't feel they can talk about it or they can be honest or they haven't been lucky enough to meet you maybe.
No.
So I
It's
love that you're talking
scary.
about it. Yeah, it's scary.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, yeah. But just if nobody takes any other message from what you said, it's just that the idea that you can't suggest it to somebody and make them, that isn't you're
Mm.
not going to it's not going to be the power of suggestion that makes this
No.
happen.
Nope,
And in
nope.
fact, you may pull them back from the idea by sitting with them and being able to, the way I learned it was just about honoring their story and
Hmm.
validating their experience and allowing them to express it. Because this idea of connections, right? It's just, we lose this connection to
Mm,
someone that makes us feel as if we matter. And that crisis line is one way that you're giving people who are in distress that
mhm.
idea that I can sit here with you. That's what I can do, you know?
That's our job. That's what we do. That's
Yeah.
such a large piece of what we do. And you got to remember too, there are people who call the Lifeline. People have a very, I think, skewed perception of what a lifeline may be. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but there are people who I get on lifelines all the time who just will immediately say to me, I really don't know if this is even appropriate for me to call. I don't know if this is the right number. I don't know if my problems are worthy." And I mean, there are people who call these lifelines because they're lonely and don't have anyone in their life. And maybe they call every day. Maybe they call every day just to have some human connection.
Mhm.
Or maybe they're going through a breakup, or maybe they are questioning their sexuality, or maybe they're coming out and they're afraid of being ostracized by their family. Or then again, you also have the people who are in emotional distress, who are maybe contemplating suicide, or maybe they are in an in process attempt and they're in imminent risk of suicide. So you've got like a whole range of possibilities out there, and every single one of those possibilities is a valid reason to call a
Yeah.
lifeline.
Yeah.
So I mean, the two tips that I would always give out relating to how do you deal with someone who's in crisis, or what do I do if I am in crisis? Number one is to ask the hard question, which we just talked about, ask someone directly. And number two, encourage someone to call 988. That's why that number is there. You know, we call 911 if there's a fire or an accident or an emergency of some kind. This is that same idea, but for our mental health. So anytime we're in crisis, we should be calling that line.
Just looked at the time. I can't believe, I feel like I just started talking to you.
I know, I know.
This is so great. Lisa, it's just really been an honor to talk to you about this. And I feel so
Thank you.
privileged to have been able to meet you and discuss this and to hear about what you do. Um, so tell the listeners what else you do and how they can find out about you. And you and I talked a little bit about some of your resources, which I think are fantastic, and they will be in the show notes. But just if you don't mind, give people kind of a summary of how they can find out more about you and the things that you are doing.
Yeah, of course. So the easiest way to find me and to find everything that I kind of put out into the world is just by going to my website, and that's lisasugarman.com. And from there, you can travel to my YouTube channel where I have, this is what you and I were talking about in the green room. Um, I started this summer creating a series called the Suicide Survivor Series. And they're just a series of short 90-second videos that drop every Monday. And they're just learnings or observations or feelings that I've had about my own suicide loss, or just grief, or loss in general, or mental illness or depression. And I'm putting these little nuggets into videos that I'm then putting out into the world with this series. Those can be found on my website. I have a column here in Boston called "We Are Who We Are." I wrote a syndicated column called "It Is What It Is" for probably a decade, um, or a dozen years, and it was more of like a general interest column. And I've kind of rebranded it with a new name and a new mission, and it's called "We Are Who We Are" now. And that's really dedicated to the same stuff that I'm putting in videos, the same stuff I'm talking about with you. It's a way to talk about the uncomfortable things that we don't want to talk about. It's a way of bringing them into the mainstream, normalizing those kinds of conversations, destigmatizing mental illness and suicide, and all these things. And so I'm putting that in my column, and that comes out every month here in Boston. And then I spend a lot of time working to add to my website. I have a pretty pretty lengthy and robust mental health resources page that's actually not a page. It's like a page that has 16 different categories for people within the BIPOC community or the LGBTQ community, or people who are looking for mindfulness resources, or veterans who are looking for resources, resources for parents with teens or young children. All of these types of resources I have broken down into subcategories to make it easy for people to find the resources that they need. All of these resources have been vetted. They all have a link that clicks you straight through to that resource. So there really isn't any thinking involved, because, I go back to my dad and the fact that my dad didn't have this kind of help available in the world where you could click a button and you could reach an organization or a lifeline. And I want those resources to be as available and accessible as possible, because when you're in crisis or someone is in crisis, the last thing in the world they're doing is searching for resources and vetting resources. They need to know where to go right now. So
Mhm.
that's kind of the goal behind creating this ever growing resource list. So that's on my website as well. My survivor stories there, and all the content that I've put out into the world.
And don't be shy. What's happening with that resource page? Who's using that as a,
Well, I do have kind of a big and exciting announcement. I'm not going to actually announce it right here, but I will say that there have been several big mental health resource platforms and organizations who have said that, I'm very humbled that they've said that it's the most comprehensive resource that they've seen out there in the world for mental health resources. And they're recommending it and sending people to it. And so I'm this close, Bonnie, to being able to say who those amazing platforms are. But it's pretty exciting. That announcement's going to come soon. But
great.
people out there on that list are saying that it's the place to go. So that's pretty gratifying.
And that's a lot of work and a lot of
Mhm.
upkeep too, I would imagine. So to have major organizations that work in this realm to be touting it as a good resource is obviously a huge compliment to you, but also a testament to your hard work putting it together. So I'm super excited for you on that. Congratulations.
Thank
And
you.
we'll
Thank you.
sure we'll hear more about that. All of this is going to be in my show notes, and all of this is going to be easily accessible so people can find you and hear about what you do and read the things that you're doing. And I'll just say it again. I'm just so, so happy you joined me here today to talk about this topic. We didn't really get into the grief. And I think because, there was just other things sort of focused on. So maybe you'll come back at some point
I
if
would
you
love
wouldn't
that.
mind. Okay. And we
Yeah,
can talk
I would
about the
love
grief.
that.
Yeah. Because that's
Hmm.
a whole separate animal.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. We could talk twice as long on just the grief piece alone. So
Yeah.
I am more than happy to come back anytime
Yeah.
and
Grief and
dig into
loss.
that. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, Lisa. It's really been a pleasure. Um,
Oh, thanks, Bonnie.
I've enjoyed this very much.
I have too. Thanks for having me.